First, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to participate in this event and to have a speech today. As a colleague said, I'm going to talk about the European Parliament, but not in a traditional way, by indicating some characteristics, by indicating the legal status, which would be, by the way, out of today's agenda, but by presenting the axiological context of functioning of this institution, the context, the axiological context, which is strictly linked with the concept of the rule of law and parliamentary standards. Well, first, what has to be said is that the European Parliament, as a constitutional institution, grows out of the idea of European parliamentarism, and it's a body whose characteristics was very clearly relate to legislators formed in the European legal culture. From the very beginning, the process of creating of this body was proceeded under an overwhelming influence of continental traditions, and led to the development of elements typical for parliamentary system of member states, especially Germany and France. And thanks to it, the European Parliament gradually, became an institution stylized as a Western European parliaments, and fit, overall speaking, into the framework of the system of parliamentary democracy. This did not mean, however, that its construction was in terms of legal construction, it was a mere hybrid of features of national parliaments. The national parliaments operating in the EU, but on the contrary, over time it acquired distinctly original features, the features which distinguished from its from classical legislatures. Such a direction was determined by the innovative tendencies which were observed in its individual path of development, and which were associated with the specifics of the process of European integration and the institutional system operating in the European Union. And it was the elements and these things just determined the formation of the European Parliament as a body with a specific system or special systemic identity, being a conglomerate, kind of mixture of elements of classical parliamentarism and elements of the Union's autonomously forming system of government. And the institution created in this way was or is interesting, definitely interesting from a research point of view, and the study of its legal characteristics must provoke various questions. The first question is to what extent the legal solutions and legal mechanisms that define the status of the European Parliament, to what extent they correspond to the traditional model of national parliaments, and to what extent, on the other hand, they go beyond it. In particular, the question here is whether this body, the European Parliament, with all its systemic and institutional peculiarities, meets the systemic minimum which results from the rule of law, and thus falls within the framework of the within the limits of the elementary standards set for parliamentary bodies in the so-called democratic world. Now the question which relates to the importance of the rule of law in the tradition of a few remarks which relate to the question, the importance of the rule of law in the tradition of European parliamentary systems. Well, parliamentarism as a form of organization of state power is a product of European legal culture. We all know this. It was shaped, it was created by a long historical process undergoing successive stages of development and taking in roots in a growing number of European states. At present, there's no European member states that does not refer to this system in one or another version. The modern formula, the modern concept of parliamentarism is strictly linked with the concept of democratic states under the rule of law, and therefore requires respect for the elementary standards flowing from this concept. Therefore, the parliament, as a center of democratic power in a state, must be formed in a given way, and at the same time must have ability to take action within a given scope. Legislators do not have a full regulatory, how to say this, freedom here, but on the opposite. They, when issuing regulations which refer to this body, to the European to a parliament, they are obliged to create a catalogue of minimum requirements. And only when they, I mean, the requirements are met, can we speak of a democratic legislature. The legislature which falls within the universally recognized concept of the rule of law. And now the axiological context in which the Parliament, the European Parliament, operates. What must be stressed in this regard is that the rule of law is one of the cornerstones of the development of the European Union. Initially, let me remind us, it was used in diplomatic activities as a value to promote united Europe throughout the world. And only in the course of time it's begun to be introduced into official community documents. The path of development here was set by jurisprudence, which by cards, which emphasizing the validity of the rule of law in the EU legal order, laid the groundwork, created fundaments for the later adopted treaty regulations. At the moment, this rule is expressed by the Treaty of the European Union, which mentions it in the main proclamation of Article 2, but also in other provisions. And it is clear that when reading these provisions, the rule of law has the rank of a legally momentous and systematically protected value and should be respected at both levels, the EU level and national level. The problem, what is the rule of law for the legal formation and functioning of the European Parliament plays a key role in my speech. The question that arises here is, questions that arise here are what axiological standards, are set by this principle and how its content and scope of validity are shaped. The most interesting thing here is where the similarities and differences between this principle and the rule of, the principle of parliamentary system and the classical rule of law concept, where they lie, these differences and similarities. After all, we know that against the background of the assumptions of classical parliamentarism, the European Parliament is different, and its legal characteristics are marked by variety of singularities. And these distinctions are, of course, due to the nature of the Union itself, which took its start from the idea of international cooperation and was a completely new creation in terms of its system. Under such conditions, in the absence of a unified subject of sovereign power and the novel organization of the apparatus of power, the old model or models of parliamentary democracy could not find full application. In particular, it was not possible to apply standards such as equipping Parliament with democratic legitimacy by sovereign people, situating it in the structure of the three-party division of power and full binding of the applicated law. This, as it is well known, constitute a democratic parliament under the rule of law. However, the obstacles to the realization, to the fulfillment of the traditional formula of parliamentarism in the system of the EU system did not mean that this formula played no role in the process of forming of the European Parliament. There is no doubt that those who were responsible for preparing the legal provisions regulating the system of this body used its axiological, resource very extensively, aiming to create a construction of a European legislature, a European Parliament, based on values known in nation states. Despite the patterns which were taken, the evolutionary shaped European Parliament has become an institution with its own peculiarities and characterized by a number of original features. And undoubtedly, also today, it differs. This institution differs in many respects from parliaments functioning in traditional countries, which remaining far from the initial ideas. What draws attention to the way it is formed is particular its democratic legitimacy, the legitimacy derived from the will of multinational community, its operation within the concept of institutional balance, as well as its tendency to expand the scope of its powers beyond the treaty. These are three features which have to be exposed here. And all these elements determine the systemic identity of the European Parliament and at the same time show that it is a body that determines a completely new format of parliamentarism. Being aware of this, we must conclude also the uniqueness of the rule of law in these aspects of its existence. And now democratic legitimacy as the first feature of the European Parliament. As it's known, in regimes based on the rule of law, it is indispensable to give a parliamentary body a democratic character. Thus, wherever we face this kind of philosophy of governance, the rule of law may be called a philosophy of governance as well as a principle, in fact. But wherever we face this philosophy of governments, a legislator must adopt constitutional solutions which create a model of representative democracy. Above all, it is within the sphere of its duties to introduce democratic principles and mechanisms for electoral process. Actually, regulations in this matter, mutatis mutandis, determine the possibility of forming the composition, creating the composition of parliament according to preferences of an electorate, and lead to equipping a legislative body, a parliament, with democratic legitimacy. Well, contrary to appearances, however, meeting the requirements of the rule of law in this regard does not mean merely adopting formal constructions. In addition to law, even the best conceived in a democratic system, the existence of a civic community and a well-functioning party system are equally important. So not only institutions, not only formal institutions, but the way that the community and party system operates. Both these elements mean that a sovereign, which is, after all, the source of power, can act as a collective and in making its choice at the ballot box has a fully clear picture of political orientations in the state. And here the question arises, to what extent the standard of the rule of law, understood in this way, corresponds to the legal nature of the European Parliament, of the current European Parliament. In particular, of interest here is whether this body can really be considered as the Article 10 of Treaty on European Union wants it to be, as a representative forum for Europeans, and whether it can be seen as a carrier of political will of a human community. Because this is exactly what the article says. I mean, that the European Parliament is based on the principle of representative democracy. And clarifying both of these questions essentially boils down to a reflection on the nature of the legitimacy that the European Parliament possesses and an entity of the European Union's central authority. What has to be said is that the European Parliament is equipped, as you maybe remember, with democratic legitimacy. And this is because of the elections which were held for the first time in 1978. The problem is that this legitimacy did not result in transforming the European Parliament to a disposer of a power delegated by the sovereign people. It's exactly the opposite. Due to the participation in the elections held of citizens of various states, who are also members of many nations, it was rather necessary to speak about or of equipping it with power by a group of sovereign people, For this reason, the model of representation, unlike classical democracy, should be probably called, and I use here a term which was used for the first time by Professor Zielonka in another context, but it should be called the model of post-Westphalian representation. The next thing, the legal status of the European Parliament in the structure of EU authorities. Under the classically perceived rule of law, it's assumed that the democratically elected parliament is related in many dimensions with or belongs to legislative power, while its place in the system of organization of power is determined by the principle of tripartition. We all know this, it's an obvious thing. No further explanations are necessary, as I believe. This is, as is well known, this results in the separation of three separate segments of power in the state: legislative, executive, judiciary. This certainly cannot be said of the European Parliament. The legal positioning of this institution presents itself in a completely different way and has nothing to do with the concept of tripartition. Well, in seeking to regulate the organizational structure of the central authorities, the treaties introduce the principle of so-called institutional balance, which positions the European Parliament in a way which is unknown to traditional parliamentary democracies. Nonetheless, this structure should be seen as a kind of Ersatz, a German word, Ersatz, of tripartition. It replaces, this principle replaces the principle of tripartition. And this fact makes us think that the European Parliament functions or operates outside the scheme of the classically perceived rule of law. Clearly, the creators of the treaties, people who were responsible for creating the treaties, rejected the patterns that existed in parliamentary democracy and broke with the concept of parliament as a legislative body that was generally accepted at the level of nation states. And the latest thing, because I'm being asked to conclude, the latest thing, the competence creep, the phenomenon of competence creep as a part of the political activity of the European Parliament. Well, you know that the basic assumption which flows from the principle of, from the rule of law concept is that public authorities are bound by applicable law and that their activities are limited exclusively to the sphere of competences that they have, which are granted to them. And under such conditions, the law becomes the only factor shaping the forms of activity of organs, and not only it can provide them with necessary legitimacy. It's beyond dispute that the primacy of law, which I'm signaling here, also applies to the European Parliament. Like any body of public authority, the European Parliament is also obliged to comply with the law and binds it, including in particular its obligations to comply with the treaty norms that define the area of its powers. But numerous experiences clearly show, and this is the problem, that Parliament happens to take actions, that in many cases the Parliament takes actions which are not directly supported by the treaty norms and even that are reserved exclusively for member states. These situations arise in the exercise of various treaty prerogatives and have to do with the phenomenon which has been occurring in the European Union for years of the EU institutions strutting within the scope of the authority granted to them. And this phenomenon, which is well recognized, is called competence creep. It covers several spheres of institutional activity of the European Union and is shared by most of the organizations institutions. And it's also a phenomenon which we can see as for acting of the European Parliament. And the European Parliament what I believe is that in this regard the European Parliament does not fulfill requirements flowing from the concept of the rule of law, which means that very often the European Parliament is out of the legal frames of the rule of law, which makes us, or it is a proof that the European Parliament does not meet the requirements of the concept of the rule of law. The competence creep, which we can observe, makes it out of the legal frameworks. Thank you very much for your attention.